Gentleman yields back. The chair now turns to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate all the witnesses being here today. And I'll start with Dr. Pastoor. You touched on your testimony, but I'd like you to expand, if you would, on additional examples besides glyphosate that were perhaps classified in a misleading way by IARC.
Well, you know, what I was trying to get at in my testimony is that things like caffeic acid, arachidonic acid, these are chemicals that we find in our diet naturally. And by just simply declaring them to be carcinogenic is not helpful to the American public. They need some context with that. And my criticism of IARC is they don't provide that kind of context.
And so, still with you, Dr. Pastoor, you've described that as a misleading way to classify these potential hazards, and you've advocated for a risk assessment as opposed to hazard assessment. And I thought, and I don't want to misinterpret, but I thought I heard Dr. Sass refer to this kind of dose level type thing as being 16th century, a 16th century approach. Do you want to rebut that?
I definitely do. I think it's absolutely as true as it was in the 16th century. And the best example I can give is the one I gave earlier on aspirin, is that the dose makes the poison. It's just as good at a low dose. In fact, the actual statement by Paracelsus in the 16th century was that the difference between a medicine and a poison is the dose. Aspirin is a good example of that. 2 tablets will relieve your headache. A bottle full of it will kill you. That's the dose makes the poison. It's as true today as it was back in the 16th century and long before that. It's important to realize that because in some of these studies that are being cited here, whether it's glyphosate or otherwise, these are animals that have been packed full of some of these chemicals for a lifetime. And I'm probably one of the few people in this room that's actually conducted those very studies. And they go on for 2 years. They're given to animals at the maximum dose that they can get. And even though Dr. Sass refers to the animals not having any adverse effects, they're getting as much as 3% of their diet of that particular chemical. That's outrageous. It's something that no human would ever see, and the results are meaningless and not useful in the context of risk assessment and communication of that information to the American public.
And Dr. Lowit, I want to just ask you quickly, I don't want my time to totally expire here, but the EPA sets tolerance levels for residue of glyphosate, and you've talked about the actual exposure to chemicals, not simply ask if a chemical could ever be a carcinogen. And EPA takes a different approach than IARC. Why does the EPA take the approach it takes?
So EPA is a risk-based organization which is consistent with federal statute, and largely for the reasons that Dr. Pastoor just explained, that it is important to assess not only the hazard but the exposure of a particular chemical. And it is at that intersection of hazard and exposure where we understand risk. And our job is to understand risk to the American people.
And I'm going to close out here by just covering a couple of statements. We've heard one of our previous questioners, when he was giving his statement prior to asking questions, says, we don't want the, quote, science we rely on is not distorted or manipulated, close quote. He didn't want that our science to be distorted or manipulated. And additionally, the idea of independent bodies look at this. We want independent bodies to be looking at these types of chemicals and potential hazards to us. But what if there is a conflict of interest? And I'm going to introduce, Mr. Chairman, without objection, I'd like to introduce a letter written in 2002, 15 years ago or so, by one of our panelists, Dr. Sass, where she noted that IARC's working groups are made behind closed doors. No transcripts of the deliberations are publicly available. Most significant, the voting of the working group members is never made public. This lack of transparency and lack of public oversight makes peer review impossible. In the letter that we received back from Dr. Wild at this point, there's no indication that any of the processes have changed in the last 16 years. And thus, I'm very concerned about IARC and their processes in issuing these monologues monographs. And so, with that, Mr. Chairman, I introduce that letter.
Without objection.